Good evening, and thank you all for coming to this event. I'm grateful to Mr. Rajendra Kumar for inviting me to speak here today, and for the Chairman C.A. Sundarajan for organizing the event. Also very grateful to the Secretary C.A. Geeta for the very kind introduction. I normally have a request, but today I didn't get a chance to speak to her ahead. I would say, please don't take more than 30 seconds to introduce me. Because if I have anything of substance to say, then people should judge me based on what I say rather than what my resume looks like. But anyway, today I didn't get a chance to speak to her ahead of time, so thank you for the very kind introduction. Actually, it's not that ideal a time for me. As you know, there are a lot of political developments. We are also still mourning the loss of our great leader for the party for the last 50 years. But when I got this invitation, I thought I should make every effort to attend. And in fact, even though it has been some time since the unfortunate and untimely demise of C.A.L.Seshadrinathan, as someone who lost my father very tragically and unexpectedly one day, I can only imagine how much pain and emotional distress it must have caused his family. So I thought it would be a great honor for me, more than for him, to kick off the series on the day the endowment is inaugurated, and to at least contribute my time and what little knowledge I can bring to this to commemorate his memory. I'd like to talk about the topic I picked myself because I didn't have much time to prepare, so I wanted to pick a topic I was very comfortable with and then quite passionate about and reasonably well informed in terms of the data. Now, we are in a very interesting phase of our evolution as a country and as a state. Politically, a lot of things are changing. You know, we are seeing for the first time for the last few years a single party majority government after many decades of coalition governments. In Tamil Nadu, we are seeing the transition, the end of an era, the two kind of Goliaths that strode over the political spectrum for at least 30 years, 35 years, are both passed within a few months, 2 years of each other. You know, things change. Some things are cyclical, some things are secular, they only go one way. Markets are cyclical, technology's development is secular, it's always ever increasing, it's never decreasing. But I thought the principles would be worth kind of thinking about, and I'm just going to give you what I hope is enough data points and perspective so we can have probably a good debate. I'll try and finish as quickly as I can, and I'm open to taking questions or to have any follow-up discussions. Federalism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Most complex concepts do. From a political perspective, when we think about federalism, we say, what should be the right kind of separation of powers between a central or a federal government and state governments, which make up the country. Now, if you look at India, we have a very unique history, because when India was formed, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago at an Independence Day celebration, I said the notion of India as a nation was an artificial construct. It had not existed in a land which had been continuously populated for thousands of years. And so if you're trying to create something, you know, where there's a blank space, it's a lot easier. If you're trying to create something where there's already rich history, rich diversity, a lot of different people. It's a very complex concept. And what is a country? It is a notion. It is a constitutionally framed notion. All countries arise out of their constitutions, and most constitutions start "we the people." It is people giving to themselves a constitution to form a country. If you look at India, the imperative in 1947 was to actually create the notion of a country that would be sustaining, as I said, where none had existed before. Certainly not the 200 years the British were there. They had ruled it at different borders. Before that, the Mughals. Before that, various kingdoms. And so it was critical that the design was one of integration. And if you look at the way the Constitution was framed, when they talk about the first list, the second list, and the third list, the way the powers were distributed between the center, the states, and then the concurrent list, there was massive overweightage towards the center. If you go and look at the list even now, the central government list is about 97 powers. And the 97th one, just I extracted it today, it says, any other matter not enumerated in list 2 or list 3, including, since all of you are CAs, any tax not mentioned in either of these. The full power to tax rests only with the central government. It is not explicitly listed anywhere else. If you compare that to the state lists, the state list used to be about 59 items. Then in the amendment in 1972, or during the emergency, whatever year that was, they took away 4 or 5 of those items, including education, and put those in the concurrent list. And the concurrent list went from 47 to 52. Majority of economic power, that is taxation, distribution of funds, aggregation, is with the center. And significant portions of the rest of governance, the criminal code, now in the concurrent list, education, most of policy making is with the center. Just numerically, the numbers are again against the states. Of course, this is not the only model in the world. If I was to go to the other extreme for a minute, a country where I lived for 20 years, the United States, the definition of that country is the United States of America, because the colonies existed before the country, because they had already created their own internal constitutions, their own sets of laws, their own taxation models, their own everything. When they decided to come together as a country, they named themselves the United States of America, and there the power is significantly with the states and very little with the center. The center focuses on a handful of things: defense, foreign affairs, trade, interstate commerce. Most of the things not included in that list, including significant powers of taxation, are with the states. There are states that have income taxes, there are states that have no income taxes. There are states that have various kinds of sales tax, there are states that don't have. So the system was designed to be a federal system where the states wanted to maintain as much of their independence as possible when they came together as a country. If you look at a more recent example over the last probably 60, 70 years, this notion of a European Union has gone through various stages. The European Economic Area, the European Community, the common currency for a little while, the banded kind of matched currency movements, the European Union, where you can be a full member, including in the monetary union. You can be a part member where you're in the political kind of standardization, but not in the monetary union. And the European Union has provided a fascinating experiment for the last probably 50 years, at least for those of us who didn't have to suffer the vicissitudes of their failures. Can you have a monetary or an economic union without having a political union? That is to say, can you run common policy on economics without having a commonly elected government, or the same laws automatically apply to everybody? And every time it failed, you can actually go back and look at why it failed, and it was this, disconnect that you simply cannot control economic policy alone. Political policy impacts economic policy. Political positions, political movements, political changes drive economic outcomes, and therefore, various attempts at forming the European Union failed. If you look at the current status, where you have this kind of two-tier membership, you can either be in the Euro and in the European Union, or you can be out of the Euro and in the European Union. Neither of those models is working particularly well. If you look back 2-3 years ago, the problems with Greece, and to lower extent with Spain, Portugal, etc., Ireland, where because they had a common currency, that means they just, not only did they have relatively common economic policy, they had one common central bank and one currency that set one interest rate, one reserve ratio, one bank regulation, etc. But the economies were completely off from each other. One was crashing and burning and the other was doing well. So you have seen the tests of it, because on the one hand, the central bank says the government cannot bail out its own banks, because then the whole system of monetary union fails, because everybody does what they want. But in other words, in a different concept, you cannot not bail them out, because how are they going to exist if they don't get some relief from their bank problems? So I would say the overall answer to that, and now we're saying with Brexit, that even on the non-monetary but economic union, that doesn't work so well either. Now Britain is leaving the European Union, though they were never in the currency and they never had the currency problems. So if you look at it from a political construct, two things become clear. One, there is no political construct that does not have an economic equivalent or an output or a counterpoint or an implication. And two, there is no model that is possible where these two are not kind of aligned with each other. You must have the alignment of the political model and the alignment of the economic model to be in sync for it to actually produce outcomes. Otherwise, the system breaks down sooner or later. In the context of India, which is what I want to talk about, we are actually a very disparate country even as we speak. That is to say, if we look back to 1947, the goal of the founding fathers, the goal of the Constituent Assembly was to create a one country out of where there had been many different kingdoms or many different fiefdoms, and the notion didn't exist before. Looking back 70 plus years, it has been a remarkable success from a political perspective. It is a clearly defined, contiguous, never been under threat of any real separatist or kind of non-democratic transfer of power, and the system works. Politically, the system works. We have regular elections. People get thrown out all the time. Elected representatives like me have to operate with the assumption that next time we have to go and face the voters based on our record and be answerable. And so the political system works very well. The economics have not been anywhere near as uniformly kind of improved as one would expect. So let me just put this in context. If I go back to the date of independence, roughly, from the 1947 to the 1960 kind of period, there wasn't actually that much difference between the states in terms of economics or social development indicators or other kind of performance measures. So I look back and I have some data going back to 1960. In income, the richest state was Maharashtra and the poorest state was Bihar, and the ratio was roughly 2:1. In age, the oldest state was Tamil Nadu, the youngest state was Gujarat. Oldest state's average age was 22, youngest state was 19. In literacy, the highest state was Tamil Nadu, 36% literacy. Lowest state was UP, 21% literacy. So we were somewhat the same country. We had differences in states, but we really didn't have such great differences. In fact, if you extrapolate that all the way till about the 90s, that didn't change that much. For those of us of my age and those who are actually here, which I wasn't, I was away in the US for 20, 30 years, US and Singapore. You will remember clearly that the whole notion of development and economic kind of progress changed after the liberalization of the 1990-91 kind of currency crisis. In some sense, that was our induction into the period of globalization or into the age of globalization. Now, if there's one defining characteristic of our adult lifetimes, it is a kind of hyper-globalization that has not been seen before. And I'll break that into two concepts. it is not true that globalization has always been secular, that it has gone from less to more. In fact, it has been cyclical. In fact, there have been times when there has been a lot more globalization and then it has pulled back. So if you look back, for example, the age of the Chinese Empire, when everything revolved around the way China traded, the age when the Indian empires were big, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the colonial era where a few countries in Europe, small countries, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, control vast tracts of the world and basically did commerce within their colonies as if it was frictionless, no tax, no VAT, no nothing, moving back and forth. But if you look at this wave of globalization is unique in the sense that because most countries are now democracies, most people have access to globalization. In the old days, you didn't have that. Only the kings and the merchants and the really rich people had access to the upside of globalization. Second, because of technology, you can actually move capital, you can move services across borders without even moving people. And finally, because of ease of travel, even labor moves around a lot. I mean, if you look at places like Singapore, Dubai, these places are built on migrant labor. There's no natural labor there. So, if you look at a comprehensive kind of measure of globalization, this is not only a high cycle, but it's a particularly broad cycle because it covers all kinds of aspects of movement of goods, labor, capital, information, services, everything. For those who have studied any kind of macroeconomics or global trade, one very black and white mathematically quantifiable phenomenon is that increased integration of markets, of any products, of any capital, always leads to greater efficiency and greater output. That's black and white, I mean, all things aside. What is not clear, and in fact can be proven to be exactly true in an inverse way, is that as much as globalization accelerates outcomes, it will also accelerate disparity. Because when you have the pie accelerating that fast, the returns don't go equally across all levels of society. Those in the knowledge economy, those that are already in the upper echelons of wealth, those that have a better foundation, those where the factories already exist will get more factories and so forth. So globalization will increase the overall productivity of the world. It will increase the overall GDP, wealth, etc. But by definition, especially within countries, it will increase disparity. It will increase the Gini coefficient. The rich will get richer. The poor will not get as rich. They'll still benefit. It's not like they're getting poorer. They will just not share in the upside to any great extent. And we have seen this in so many ways. In fact, one could argue that what we see in the form of Brexit, what we see in the form of kind of the Tea Party movement and the Donald Trumps and the anti-immigrant waves in the US, are actually the anti-globalization backlash. That people have seen the upside go too much of it goes to too few people and they want parity back. You know, someone once explained to me very clearly, he said that the thing about money is that it's never absolute. It's always relative. You know, we don't judge ourselves on have I got X or have I got 2X or have I got 5Xs. What have I got relative to something else, relative to the per capita, relative to my neighbor, relative to my brother. And because of that, this disparity usually tends to social and political unrest. And in a democracy, people actually have ways to express that. If you take India, it is very clear what happened to these differences. Right? If you look at post-1990 and coming up to today, these differences have hugely accelerated between the states. If I take 2015 data, in Tamil Nadu, the average income, that is the per capita income, was 1.36 lakh rupees. In Bihar, it was 35,000. So 4:1. Now, this Indian average at the time was about 82,000 rupees or so. age, Tamil Nadu has a rapidly aging problem. We have gone below the replacement rate of births per woman, and the average age in Tamil Nadu is 30 years old. In Bihar, it is still 19. Education. In Tamil Nadu, the average citizen is a high school graduate. In fact, in the assembly, in the recent demand for grants of the budget session, the government of Tamil Nadu's education department put out a statistic that is remarkable. It says that in Tamil Nadu, the gross enrollment ratio, that is, what percentage of college-going children actually enroll in a college, in a degree college, not in a polytechnic, in a degree college, degree granting institution. That number is something above 46% for Tamil Nadu. That's a remarkable number. That says 1 out of 2 people are going to college. Now, it's a different matter about the quality of the college, the quality of the education, all that. I'm not here to debate that. But 46% in a developing country, where the country's average is 23%. And the next best state is Kerala, which is at some 36 or 37%. And 46% incidentally is higher than what the US's gross enrollment ratio is. So this, kind of a disparity leads to this outcome where the average Tamil Nadu citizen is a high school graduate, age 30, making 1.36 lakhs, and has slightly greater chance of being a woman than a man. The gender ratio also is slightly skew of the women. Whereas in Bihar, the average citizen is 19 years old, makes 35,000 rupees, has dropped out at elementary school. Right? Elementary school dropout, not graduated elementary school. And there's a noticeably different probability of being a man than a woman. So, 2 questions arise. If we have such great disparity, what caused it? And is it getting better or is it getting worse? Because I say, from 47 to 60, it was not that different. From 60s to 90s, it started accelerating. And once we opened up and joined the global economy, and if you all look back, since you're the chartered accountants who help companies come set up and expand and all that, you think about the infusion of capital of multinational companies, of manufacturing, of FMCG, and you look at every aspect from hotels to cars to glass to, I don't know, I'm just thinking about the industries just around Chennai. So, what was the reason for that, and what was the consequence, and is it getting more or less equal? Now, if you put all the pieces of the puzzle together from what I said, obviously it says that if you started in the right place, you have a greater acceleration and greater kind of multiplier effect, and if you didn't start in the right place, you have a lower. What is the right place? You have good education, average skill level. You have, qualified and kind of disciplined workforce. You have an enlightened government. You have historical trade relations. The Tamils had gone and invested and invaded in Southeast Asia and settled in all over the world. So you have a natural pullback. And you have enough land mass, and you put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But I think the key goes back to education, because I can't think of any other variable that was that different between a place like Tamil Nadu and if you take more, places like UP or Bihar or Madhya Pradesh or any of those states. Now, one of the ways that most federal countries or federal unions offset this, incidentally, this is not unique to India. It's not unique to our state compared to other states. They're all over the world. Any country you go, you will find some states are doing very well, some regions are doing very well, and some are not. There are various reasons, population, kind of attractiveness, natural resources, whatnot. I'll just give you an example. If you take New York or California in the US, the substantial proportion of the GDP of the US comes from big states like New York and California, and places like, let's say, North Dakota or South Dakota have populations that are about 10% of the city of New York. The whole state, which is a huge state, has population. So it's not expected that you'll have great economic activity there. And surely in any federal system, you will find transfer payments. That's what the central government's job is. It collects taxes from places where they make more money and have greater economic activity, and it sends them to those places that have less economic activity and need basic services. The job of the government, among other things, is to redistribute enough wealth to ensure there's no social unrest and to make sure that everybody participates in developments in, let's say, child nutrition, maternal welfare, developmental investment, stuff like that. But what is unique about India is if you now start bringing in things like the finance commissions, which we have every 5 years, that talk about how the government of India starts redistributing the wealth, you will find that the finance commission's recommendations obviously are going exactly inverse to the kind of spread and output that I'm talking about. So if I go back 4 finance commissions, Tamil Nadu's share of central taxes was about 10.5%. Then it dropped to about 8.5%. Then it dropped to about 7%. Then it dropped to about 6%. Now we're at about 4.5%. And if the 15th Finance Commission goes through with the formula that they say they started their terms of reference with, our payout will come down to something like 3.5%, maybe 4%. We are about 7% of the, or less than that, less than 7% of the population of India, and roughly about 8.5%, 9% of the GDP of India. But even if we assume that our payment of taxes is roughly 9%, it's actually more than that, then we are only going to get back about 1/3 of what we pay, about 3.5%. Nothing wrong with that per se, because everywhere rich states subsidize poor states. That's how you bring the country equal. This happens in India, it happens in America, it happens in Europe, it happens in China. In fact, the biggest transfers of the European Union went from places like France and Germany, and to whatever extent the UK contributed as part of the European Union without monetary, to places like Spain and Portugal. And in a good system, like happens in China, where the coastal provinces pay more taxes and that money gets sent to the central interior provinces, you will find that these transfer payments lower the gap. That's the job of transfer payments, whether it's transfer payments within society or transfer payments across states. You take from those who have more and you give to those who have less, and therefore you bring them to greater equality. So the rate of climb in Tamil Nadu slows, the rate of climb in Bihar or UP rises, and you get more of a fair and equitable society. That is the ambition of redistribution. That is the job of every government. In India, we have not been able to achieve that. As the rate of transfer has increased, the rate of disparity has kept on increasing. So we are actually keeping on transferring more and more and getting less and less equality. We're keeping on getting more and more divergence. This is very rare. It's a very uncommon phenomenon around the world. Transfers are very common. They happen all the time. What is uncommon is to keep making transfers and not get convergence. Not just not get convergence, but actually see increasing divergence. Which then raises the question, what is causing this divergence? Is giving money simply not enough? There are schools of thought. There's a kind of right-wing economic theoretician, historian called Neil Ferguson, Scottishman, who used to teach in Harvard for many years and now has gone back to the UK, I think at Oxford. And he says, democracies function based on the strength of institutions. If you have strong institutions, the courts, the police system, the licensing of vehicles and drivers, you pick the institutions that regulate the way a society works. If you have strong institutions, then you will get good outcomes, including that if the money comes, those institutions will actually ensure you get the benefit of those funds. And if you do not have such institutions, no matter how much money you give me, I cannot make it give output because it will get stolen or wasted. Basically, stolen means rent seeking, corruption, call it what you want, or it will not bring growth. In India, I think part of the problem is obviously we are a far from perfect society. A lot of politicians have lots of different sources of income. A lot of government programs get diverted in a lot of different ways. But part of the problem, I believe, is this lack of institutions and the lack of education. We are not able to put in a framework for growth. And the big difference between the states that are able to achieve the growth and those who are not is not just money, it is the lack of a framework. Now, just to give you the nature of the kind of quantities involved. Back in 2015, a friend of mine and I did some work. In Maharashtra, the average citizen kind of puts in about 33,000 rupees in annual tax payments to the center, direct and indirect together. The center puts back about 5,000 rupees per person into Maharashtra. So the ratio is roughly about 15%. Now, Maharashtra is a bit of a unique case because the government doesn't put out the data directly and we have to do all kinds of inferences and extractions. And there's a lot of companies headquarters in Bombay, the exchanges trade out of Bombay, a lot of the financial transactions happen out of Bombay, so that's not a good basis. If you take states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, to some extent Gujarat, average citizen pays about 20,000, this per capita, right? I'm not talking, I mean, after adjusting for population. Per capita, the average citizen pays in about 20,000 rupees in taxes to the central collection of whatever 16, 17 lakh crores taxes. Average citizen gets back about 6,000 rupees in central grants and subsidies and scheme support. That's about, I don't know, 25 to 30%. You go like that and you go to the other extreme, you get to a place like UP, where the average citizen pays in about 7,000 rupees and gets out about 11,500 rupees. Then you go to the other extreme, where you go to Bihar, and it's about 7,000 rupees in and 30,000 rupees out. It's basically 4:1. Now, again, this is not per se a bad thing. The question is, what are we getting for this? Are we getting convergence or are we not getting convergence? If you look at the counter arguments, a friend of mine and I did this work out of, I don't know, better judgment because I was in politics. I withdrew my name from it and my friend went ahead and published it in his name. And he became the subject of all kinds of vicious trolling. But in the course of the trolling, the one cogent argument that came back, it said, actually, you say that you are contributing more for nation building and the fact that we buy aeroplanes and ships and you support your fellow man and all that, but you must understand that places like UP and Bihar are giving up something, and they are. And what are they giving up? For those of you again who can think back to that age, back in '76 when they passed the amendments about what was going to go to the concurrent list and all that, Mrs. Gandhi also passed some constitutional amendments about locking down representation to the parliament. So at that time, she said, since my target for the country is population control, I will propose, and of course, then the Congress ran most of the states and the center, and the constitutional amendment passed. The constitutional amendment said we will not do redistricting of Lok Sabha seats for 25 years. Because if you do redistricting of Lok Sabha seats, those who have lower birth rates will start giving up seats to those who have higher birth rates. So I said, then there's no incentive for you to, it's like punishing the good performers who we say reduce the population. So we said, you keep reducing the population and we will not take away your seats. So that constitutional amendment passed in 1976. It locked the seats that we see today, that is 39 for Tamil Nadu, 1 for Pondicherry, X for Kerala, 19 for Rajasthan, whatever it is. In 2001, when that 25-year constitutional amendment expired, the then Vajpayee government went through a lot of discussion and decided that it was going to be too problematic to reopen to redistricting and said we will extend this for another 25 years. So till 2026, the number of seats will not get changed and we are all where we are. Now think about the democratic implications of that. In Tamil Nadu, the average Lok Sabha seat is about 14 to 15 lakh registered voters. So about 2.5 lakh voters per MLA constituency. And there are 6 MLA constituencies for every MP constituency. In UP, just as one example, the Gorakhpur constituency, where the current Chief Minister vacated after being 20 years the MP and then becoming Chief Minister, that constituency has 19.6 lakh registered voters. And that's pretty typical of UP. That means the average UP voter, only 20 lakh of them get to see one MP. In Tamil Nadu, 15 lakh of us get to see one MP. Question is this truly representative democracy? Or are they taking a cut? Are they paying some kind of a representation kind of penalty or price at our benefit? Now, these are some really important issues because in 2026, this thing is going to expire and we're going to have to go back to redistricting. And some people have done very interesting research using the current population and said, for example, if we were to redistrict based on population alone today, Tamil Nadu should go down from 39 seats to about 33 seats. We should lose roughly about 15% of our seats. And likewise, because unlike America, there's a big difference between America and India. In America, the most populous states are also the ones that have the greatest economic activity. New York and California are the most populous states, and that's where the most economic activity happens. That's where the most taxes are collected. That's where the greatest subsidy donors come from. And per capita, they're actually paying less because there are more people to divide the cost of subsidy. Whereas in India, it's the other way around. The most populous states, densely populated states, have the lowest economic activity as a rule, and therefore the ones who should have greater representation are the ones who are in the greatest need of subsidy. Which then brings up the point, what happens in 2026? If I am a citizen of Tamil Nadu, what is my incentive to keep on giving up representation in Delhi and keep on paying more and more in contributions to the center? If they produce good results, it's a different story. But if I keep paying them and they keep leading to greater and greater disparity, where my share of payouts has gone from 10% down to 4% and now going below 4%, where is the system? This is why I think federalism is realistically the only solution. We need to reconsider where the separation of powers are. We are no longer operating in an economic model that is similar enough. It was never identical, doesn't have to be. But we are no longer operating economic models across states that are similar enough that the overwhelming majority of policy making, taxation, and general kind of governance can come out of Delhi. Now we've seen the flip side of that. This government, no politics, just execution. This government came to power and created one cess after another. Now, what is the great luxury of cesses? As you know, they don't have to be put into the tax pool and they don't have to be shared according to the Finance Commission ratios. They can be targeted and spent to those programs that were set under the original cess. So you take a Swachh Bharat or any one of these other cesses. The problem is, the central government every year has been unable to spend the majority, in some cases 75, in some cases 80%, but in every year more than 50% of the targeted cess money has not been spent. Because you can collect Swachh Bharat Abhiyan cess, you cannot spend it without then diverting it back to the states and having them build the toilets. The central government has no mechanism to build toilets. It doesn't have a department that can go around the country and start identifying land and acquiring and building. Even to build a national highway, the government of Tamil Nadu has to acquire the land, then the central government will come use the funds to build roads. So it is almost impossible that you can sit in a country of 1 billion and 300 million people in a central place and drive policy and execution to your desired goals. It's not been done anywhere else in the world, short of dictatorial communist China, and it's not a model that works. If anybody wants to go through the logistics or kind of simulation modeling of that. So if you put all these numbers and everything in context, the question is, surely at some point we must become a more representative democracy. It is not a sustainable model where, I'll just take an example in my constituency. There are 22 wards. Some wards, because of the absence of redistricting and the government's kind of laxity, some wards have 4,000 voters. Some wards have 27,000 voters. In my own constituency of 2.5 lakh people, how is it fair that 4,000 people have a councillor who sits on the mayor and the town council, corporation council, and decides how the funds get spent, and 27,000 people have to only access one? It's not fair. So, I went to court among other people and we asked for redistricting and we said make it average something like 10,500 to 2.4 lakh people across 22 wards, redefine the wards so that A, they're contiguous, B, the logical, all that stuff. But average voters must go down to 10,000. Otherwise, it's not fair. Surely that argument must come in 2026 when we say, let's get equal representation. Why should we get only 15 lakh people to an MP and they get 20? But if that happens, the follow-up question is, if with 39 MPs I'm not able to get the right outcomes and keep seeing my share go down, why am I going to be happy with 33 MPs to do that? So, if there was a way to improve the implementation and execution model directly, which there isn't and there hasn't been in any other democratic system that I know of, if you have to end up with the states doing the execution anyway, even for something as simple as building toilets, and if the fact is that the states are completely different in any basic measure, human development index, child mortality rates, birth rates, education rates, sanitation levels, college access. And they're different in bad ways also. Something like 40% of the educational loans being taken every year are taken in the state of Tamil Nadu alone. In all of India, educational loans being taken from nationalized banks, many of which turn out to be non-performing, to create problems for the banks, are taken in Tamil Nadu alone. So there's always good and bad sides to everything. I'm not saying one thing is always good. The question is there any other model that will allow for flexibility in execution, parity in kind of representation versus distribution or redistribution, and will allow you to adapt to the realities that at an economic level, we are not operating anywhere in the realm of each other. We are not, if you look at this, just compare it to a global standard. We are close to, in the state of Tamil Nadu or Kerala or Karnataka, we are close to, or Gujarat for that matter, we are close to a middle income country in the world. And we are not small states. We are 75, 80 million. And Tamil Nadu by itself would be the 18th or 19th largest country in the world. So it's not that, the scale is not a problem. Scale is a problem. But after this, we are operating as if we were economically a middle income country. There are parts of India that are operating as if they are sub-Saharan countries in terms of infant mortality, birth rates, maternal, health issues, sanitation levels, income levels, education levels. So I would say in conclusion that everything affects everything else, of course. Politics is economics, economics is politics. But in the case of federalism, what we have learned over 70 years of independence, and particularly over the last probably 25 plus years of participation in the global economy, that there is no alternative to an increasingly federal model, because every other approach gives you fundamental unfairness, either unfairness in representation or unfairness in redistribution, or kind of you sacrifice unfairness in representation for unfairness in distribution, and you try to trade off the two, which are not like for like trade-offs. And so in this next 5 to 10 years, especially with the constitutional amendment expiring, this is going to be one of the defining issues of our democracy in our lifetimes. And I hope that, myself included, many of us will come back to another Seshadrinathan Memorial Lecture at some point in the future, where we can see how this debate has evolved, what kind of new issues and what kind of insights and events have driven the debate. And once again, pay tribute to his memory and to the loss of Varun's father and to his father's son. With that, I'll conclude my remarks, and I've spoken for about 45 minutes, for a little over 40 minutes. I'm happy to take questions or get in a discussion if anybody has. No, listen, I'm not, of course we have different political principles of who wants what. I'm just trying to tell you that the facts are the facts. The facts are we are a very disparate country today. Disparate in representational rights, and disparate in economic conditions. I think the even more important point is that I don't see convergence. The more we have transferred the money, the more the gap has kept on growing. So I don't see a solution, because clearly we are one nation. Clearly we have to stop the gap growing, both the gap in representation and the gap in economic outcomes. And, taxation policy, for example, might be completely different given Tamil Nadu circumstances and given Bihar circumstances. Right? I might want to invest more in cleaning up the higher education system because my school education system is pretty much fixed. Bihar might want to focus more on doing the school education system, and they'll require different types of funding. So let me give an example of what independent kind of decision making allows. This concept of education was a critical component of the Justice Party's view of the world. Remember, the original Justice Party founders were not all like, socialists, or they were landed, Oxbridge educated, globally aware people, and they understood the value of education. So they put compulsory education as the rule in 1920, compulsory elementary education for boys and girls. What happened shortly thereafter? Many people didn't show up. I mean, just because I make a law doesn't mean they comply, right? If the compliance rate is 95%, I can easily force the remaining 5% to comply. If the compliance rate is 20%, what do? I can't arrest 80% of the people or throw them in jail. So to create an incentive to comply was when the Madras Corporation first came up with the concept of the free food being supplied to children at school to increase the likelihood of compliance. That program started in 1921-22. It kept on expanding. When Kamaraj came, he said, I expanded to all poor children all over, below a certain economic standard. When MGR came to power for the first time, he had this brilliant idea. He said, I will make it for every child who ever attends every school. Now, at that time, that cost was projected as something like 500 crores, which in those days was going to produce this huge, budget deficit, which was not fillable anyway. But because he had 100% control of sales tax at that time, he said, I will simply hike the sales tax rate by 1% across every product in the entire state of Tamil Nadu. And 1% he got back 500 crores. In 500 crores, he did the noon meal scheme. In 20 years, the literacy level and the graduation of elementary school level went up by 15, 18 percentage points in the population. In one generation, it went up that much. Now that is fundamental policy making, which is based on local conditions, local priorities, using local taxpayers' money for local, policy making. Now, we have all seen this notion of NEET and all this stuff, right? I have had one problem with the whole notion of NEET from the beginning. It is not about standardized tests or central exams. I have written the GRA, I have written the GMAT, I've scored well enough, I succeeded. I'm an open quota guy. I didn't benefit from reservation any time in my life. The point is how you set up admission to medical colleges, which are funded 100% by state money. This is not funded by central taxation or that. This is funded by state money. How I set up admission to medical colleges, and particularly postgraduate, and how I give advantages to government doctors practicing in rural areas and all that, affects the outcome of my health policy. By everybody's definition, health policy is a state subject. The government of India doesn't run health. In the constitution, it is under the 54 remaining state subjects. So if you start interfering in the way that exams are conducted, I'm not an apologist for fee collection, for wrong things happen all over the place. I'm not defending that. But my point is, if you start setting policies in ways that affect my outcomes in health department, which is my state subject, then surely I start wondering whether this is anti-federalism rather than federalism. Right? So I'm only saying that unless you find out a way to either make one size fit all and then make sure that we all improve, or you find out a way that if you set your mind to it sitting in Delhi, you can actually make it execute in 29 states, and 3 union territories. You have no other choice but to start devolving power and devolving policy making to the states. This is not about politics, this is not about any slogan. This is just the hard reality of economic outcomes and economic failures. Transfer payments are not resulting in a narrowing of the gap. That's just statistically proved. Education is currently compulsory. The law says you have to send your children to school or you can be prosecuted. So education by law is compulsory. Whether it actually produces the results or not is a different story. And again, in those states where they don't get the compliance, if compliance is 95%, you can force the 5%. If compliance is 50%, how many people will you prosecute for not complying? So I think that's one problem. I completely agree that corruption is a problem. Corruption is a problem in ways that most people don't understand. They don't understand the insidious nature of what happens when rent seeking occurs and the consequences of that in terms of the deadweight loss to the economy. One thing if corruption, just changes that it goes from this hand to that hand. But because of the nature of corruption, the aggregate output of a state or a town or a city actually goes down. So, the classic example, I'm a member of the Public Accounts Committee of the Assembly. So we get to see the audit reports and we get to see all these cases where there have been, arbitrage. It's a confidential proceeding until we table the reports in the full Assembly House. We are not allowed to talk about it. But I can generically say that I've seen so many examples where the accusation is that somebody has caused a loss of 2 crores or 5 crores on paper to the state because they should have collected this, that, or the other. But in fact, if you look at it, the loss will be in the tens or hundreds of crores. We'll be prosecuting this fellow and we'll say, oh, we should cut off his government pension of 2 lakhs or 5 lakhs or something. But the loss has been hundreds of crores. So in many cases, this happens that the alleged volume of corruption is not matched to the actual loss to the state and the public. You see what I'm saying in terms of deadweight loss. This is neither going in this hand or that hand. It is simply a net loss to society. So I don't disagree with all that. My question is, how does federalism make that worse? It's already as bad as it is, right? If we keep transferring money to places like Bihar and UP and you're not able to get increased output or increased human development or improved health, then surely corruption is happening there in greater or equal measure to any other state. It's not that there's corruption in Tamil Nadu and there's no corruption in UP. First, I should say that I'm probably not the most qualified guy to answer this because, once you get to local politics, you worry more about things like gutters that are backed up and drinking water that has not been supplied. So these are very high-level macroeconomic questions. But I also travel quite a bit and I'm still in touch with many of my investment banking colleagues. So I would say in general, most of the EU's happiness is just, what can I say, wounded pride. They are upset that somebody who is benefiting from the system, in their minds, who was getting as much or more as they were giving, are now leaving. And they feel it is disruptive and they say, okay, good riddance then, get out as quickly as you can. In fact, they were not in the monetary union, which makes the divorce a bit easier, if you will. It would have been a lot more complex if they were in the euro. Clearly, there are short-term negatives to the UK. For example, I worked in the investment banking industry. That and the financial kind of asset management industry will significantly shift out of London, which was by far the biggest center in the European Union, to more of Frankfurt or Paris or other places. And London will lose its importance. It will not become number 2. It will still be number 1, but it won't be number 1 by a factor of 2 or 3. It will be a number 1 by 20% or 40%. Whether that means anything for trade with India, it's harder for me to say. I will say that the EU is probably the leading edge of standards, quality criteria, environmental kind of requirements and so forth. So being a supplier to a EU customer is always one of the harder things to do if you're an Indian manufacturer or a service provider. There are rules around privacy, around data secrecy, around quality, around environmental tests and all that are much higher. So on the margin, I would guess that having broken out of the EU, the UK standards will not be as stringent and should provide some marginal relief. Sometimes these things have a way of self-regulating. None of these events are earth-shattering, right? I mean, in my understanding, whether a free trade agreement works or not is not going to change it from kind of, millionaire to poverty, right? Usually these things are incremental changes. In fact, there was a very good analysis by an ex-MIT professor, Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize, who now teaches at Princeton. But he said, even if all the worst of the expectations of the trade wars and the tariffs and the counter tariffs and this anti-globalization backlash leads to all kinds of barriers to trade, is not likely to shave more than a point or point and a half of the GDP. It's not going to lead to doom and gloom and calamity and collapse. Now, of course, we have to see that in perspective. Right? 1% of a 15 or $14 trillion economy is not a small number. It's not, it's not insignificant. It's just not, on-off switch. It's not a with this I'll live and with this I'll fail, without this I'll fail, or with this I'll succeed. It will have impact. It will have significant impact, but it will not be kind of structural change. Over 10 years, of course, the incremental 1% in compounding will have a big difference. But in 10 years, policy may change again. So I'm not sure I can tell what the implications for Indian exporters is, or Indian trade partners is to the UK. I would say on the margin, probably slightly beneficial, but I can't quantify that. As much a privilege as it is to know Mr. Ravi for so many years, he never fails to embarrass me in public. So I can assure you I didn't put him up to this, but I'm very grateful for his kind compliment.